I first began paid ministry, okay? Like many of you, I was involved in just saying, God, whatever I can do, help me to do. When I was a teenager, how many of you were involved in youth ministry when you was one? When you were a youth minister, you were involved in youth ministry. But I came to a point where I actually finished my trade and went to finish my second year. I'd already taken 1 year of Bible college when I first got out of high school, and then took a trade and then went back and ended up in a church that had been in a building program. As a matter of fact, the day that I met the fellow that was going to hire me as my lead pastor, he invited me the next day not to go and look for a place to stay, but to come and take a look at the church. We met him that night, and he offered me a job that night, said, tomorrow let's go in, I'll show you the church, I'll show you the area we are. And it's part of Edmonton I'd never been in because I was from Drayton Valley. So the south and the west end of Edmonton was Edmonton. Centennial Mall, remember Centennial Mall? Centennial Mall, where we got my sister. We bought her from Woco. Really? The social services was directly above Woco. So we went into the Woco store, and that was Edmonton. Occasionally I got down to the center of Edmonton, went to Jasper Avenue, but I'd never been in the northeast corner, so we went there. When I got to see this church, we got a pretty nice building, maybe twice the size of this or something like that. But then on the outside of it, there was a cement wall for obviously the foundation and the basement walls of a new building. In fact, they were putting the tar on the basement so they could backfill it. So we're in a building program, obviously. I didn't know about that, but when I got there, I caught on to the rest of the story. Some churches go through tough times. This one had gone through a tough time. Sometimes it's the pastor's fault. Sometimes it's one key leader in the church. In this case, it was really an issue of a lead pastor who just had a security issue. And I think I understand why he had a security issue, because I've been in missions. When I go to Tanzania, they think I'm 1,000 better than what I am. Now, the blessing of not going into missions until you're 50 years old, when I first went to Tanzania, by that time I knew I wasn't near as good as they thought I was. There was absolutely no question in my mind that the way they put me on a pedestal was like a turtle on a fence post. If you find a turtle on a fence post, you know he never got there by himself. Okay? God put him in that place, or someone put him in that. He never climbed that thing himself. They put you up on a fence post like, I never got there. It was God who put me in a place where I could have the opportunity to do what I'm doing in Tanzania. Well, this guy started his ministry in Africa. And then he came to Canada as a pastor. And I think maybe that's why when he started to have staff, if they didn't agree with everything he said, he found that was very traumatic to him. And he couldn't handle that. And so he had actually a history of 3 churches that I'm aware of, that when some people started to indicate that they really appreciated one of the other pastors and staff, that was an offense to him. You know, the Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians, don't claim that I'm from Paul, or I'm from Apollos, or I'm from Peter. The real issue is there's nothing wrong with having personal preferences. The fact is, some of you like Pastor Blackmer better than me. That is the truth. And I don't know a whole lot about him. I've heard him speak a couple times when I was here visiting my parents. But I don't know a whole lot of them. But I do know that some people prefer his ministry over mine. That's okay, because there might be a couple that like me too. The truth of the matter is, you have preferences, right? I know when I go to a camp and there's 4 speakers, I know there's one that really spoke to me, and quite often there's one that I should have gone shopping that day because I didn't get anything out of it. And sometimes one of the occupational hazards of being a preacher is you can be critical of other preachers. Just like whatever your job is, if you're a carpenter, you walk in the room and you notice things that other people don't notice, but you notice them because that's your job. And well, this guy had that issue, and so on one Sunday, now we're going back about 3 months before the pastor hired me. Okay, so a different pastor was at the church, and one Sunday morning he got up and he said, "We have a Judas among us, and it's him," and he points to his associate pastor. Now, the fact of the matter is, the church was really growing. I saw the record of the attendance, and it was doing terrific. They were running about 230, 240, but the graph of them getting there was just, the church was doing absolutely terrific. And then this fella started to feel intimidated. He made that statement, and of the attendance, can you guess what happened? Like it dropped like this, and then it kept going down. And eventually he resigned as well. They called a new pastor. About 4 months after that, 3 months after that, he called Roberta and I to be the youth pastor. So we joined this church that was in the middle of this building program, which we didn't need anymore. We needed it when there were 240 people. But now we've got 100 or less, 80 people at a service. We didn't need, our church was bigger than we needed already. We didn't need to fill this. But part of the mindset was we should go ahead because we don't want to lose the momentum. Well, they had lost the momentum. They just didn't realize it. They had lost the momentum and tried to go ahead and keep building. Well, so what happened over the next 3 years, while I'm the youth pastor, is every year we'd try and raise funds to save what we had already put into the building program. So when I got there was cement walls, but there was no roof over it, or no floor. And so they got the cement walls covered in tar, backfilled it. The next year we raised it so that we could put a floor on, and at least that way the rain wouldn't get in as much. It's still flat. There's no shedding. The rain is going to get in. But anyway, we got the floor on. The following year, we raised money and we put heat in the bottom so the cement wouldn't all crack and break. The year after that, we managed to get walls up so we could get a roof on, and we managed to get the roof finished enough so it would shed water, but the walls were just wood. They weren't finished at all. About that time, I became the lead pastor. And the next time that we had a mission month, I said to our board, let's do something that has nothing to do with us. And one of the guys said, hey, do you remember Bruce Nurse? He had been part of our church. He went to Bible college. He now is up Northwest Territories as a missionary in Northwest Territories. Let's talk to Bruce and see if we can do something for him. We'll take a special offering for this missionary that was part of our congregation. That sounds like a good idea. And so I phoned Bruce and asked him if there's anything. You know what he wanted? Do you remember something called the Gestetner machine? The younger ones won't. But this used to be what we call photocopiers. They would have tape, not on paper, but on this black piece of carbon that had some wax paper on both sides of it, and they would type out what they wanted to type. And then they would put that in this machine that was kind of like an old-fashioned printing machine, and they would crank this big crank, and it would copy, 2 copies, 3 copies. And used to go to, when I was young, I'd see teachers printing 32 copies of whatever it was we needed that day with this big crank. That's what we called photocopiers in those days. He wanted a Gestetner machine because he had 3 bulletins that he printed every Sunday. He didn't have a real big congregation up there, but he printed 3 bulletins every Sunday, and he'd have to print them 3 times. He thought, if I had a Gestetner machine, I could just print them once and then give 3 copies of it. And I said, I'll tell you what, Bruce, we'll buy you a computer. Oh, I have no idea how. Well, I'll teach you how to use a computer, but you'll find that if you have a computer and we give you a printer, getting 3 copies is much easier than a Gestetner machine. So we bought them, or we were going to buy him that. I said to the board member, Mike, who was going to take the offering or count the offering, he was the one who came up with the idea, hey, we should help Bruce, nurse, and his wife and his family. They had 2 boys, and buy this for him. And so we're coming to our anniversary Sunday, and I said, now, if we get more, we needed like $1,400 in one offering. That was a pretty big offering for us. If we get more than 60 or 70%, I want a report, because we need to celebrate. We've been in this trying to do the next step so we don't lose what we've lost so far for 4.5 years now. We need to celebrate. So if we get more than like $1,000 or something, could you come and give me a report just at the end of my sermon? Well, I get to the end of the sermon, here comes Mike, and I think, I know very well that Mike is going to come up and say thank you to everyone, even if we only got $400. That's just Mike. So I thought, well, here he comes, and he hands me this paper, and I look at it and think, I can't remember the number. I think it was 12,000. It was like so far above and beyond our goal. I asked him if he made a mistake before I made the announcement. No. I said, now, is this pledges? No, that's money we've received today. And so I said, I can't hardly believe the number that Mike just gave me. But this morning, when we were supposed to raise $1,400, we raised $12,000. And this wave of excitement and thrill went through the congregation that literally I can pinpoint as the pastor. That was the moment when our church changed their attitude from we're holding the fort to we're doing something for Jesus. We're on the map. We are a church that's moving ahead, and there was a very specific moment, and that was it, when all of a sudden everything changed in that church. And that's what happened in Ezra's day when Cyrus overthrew Babylon. Now, Cyrus had already been in power in Persia. The Babylonians were the biggest nation, and they were over Persia, but Persia became stronger and became independent. And 20 years after, so 559 was when Cyrus became the leader of Persia, but it was 20 years after, 539 years before Jesus, that he then overthrew Babylon and said to the Jews in the very first reign, if you want to come back and build your temple, you've got my blessing. In fact, I will help pay for it. And they came back and they started building this temple and altar, and that they had been without. Like, these are the Jews. They have some things that are very important to them. One of them is the land that God promised them. But they hadn't had that for 70 years. They'd been in Babylonian captivity. The land was no longer theirs. And another one was the temple of God. But when Nebuchadnezzar took over Israel, he destroyed Jerusalem and burned the temple and destroyed the temple. So they haven't had that. And they have the Word of God. Well, that was one thing they still had. They still had the Word of God. And they were so thrilled that they still had that. But of the three major things that identified them as a nation, two of them were gone. And now this new king says you can rebuild, you can go back and you can rebuild the temple. Anyone who wants to can throw donations in, and I'll throw a bunch in myself. And so they went back, and the very first thing they did was let's rebuild the altar. And so they rebuilt the altar. Took them 2 years to get the foundation done and the altar built. And then they had this huge celebration because once again, every sacrifice that they had to perform from all the Old Testament sacrifices, daily sacrifices, weekly sacrifices, monthly sacrifices, annual sacrifice, all the sacrifices started to happen again. And they were back doing what they had been longing to do since their grandparents 70 years ago told them what they used to do every day. And there was excitement. And then they started to build the temple. But last time I spoke, chapter 4, we came to this particular verse. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building the temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came and said, let us help you build, because like you, we seek the Lord, and we've been sacrificing to him since the time the king of Assyria, who had taken them out of the northern kingdom, 207 years before the southern kingdom was destroyed, since he took us out of Israel. But the peoples said, no, you're not going to build the temple with us. Haven't been sacrificing to our God. In fact, you rejected our God when we divided between northern Israel and southern kingdom of Israel. You haven't been serving God. You've been serving idols and Baals, and you kind of tuck God in with it. You know, that's what New Age is. We haven't heard a lot about it in the last few years, but that's what New Age really is. New Age is, I'm so glad that you've got a religion. And I honor it, and I believe in it, and I fully accept what you have. Along with everybody else's religion, and any that we might make up next week. We just believe it all. How can you believe the only God, and he created everything, and Buddha's the only God, and he created everything? That's about as stupid as when they split the kingdom, and Jeroboam, who now is in the northern kingdom, he can't send his people back to Jerusalem. He says, well, let's. So they made 2 golden calves, and they said, now these are your gods. Now, if he had stopped there, at least I can understand it, but he didn't say that. He said, these are your gods who brought you up out of Egypt. Every person in the nation knew that that was a lie, and yet they started to worship the new God. This whole thing of the New Age, it's not popular because it's logical, it's popular because it's convenient. Okay, he's wrong. Everybody's right. Well, they said, that's what you've been doing, and so you're not going to have any part of building. So then, let me read the next verse. The peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah, make them afraid to go on building. They hired counselors to work against them, to frustrate their plans. Here's how long it went on. During the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, that was from the time that he first said they could come back. He's already reigned 20 years. Then from then all the way till 520, so another 19 years. During the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So there was two other kings that reigned in between there, and then Darius. So now we've gone down another from 19. Now we're down at 30 years. At the beginning of the reign of Xerxes, now we just jumped another about 15 years. They lodged an accusation against the people. And in the days of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Now we jumped another 35 years. So in those two verses, he jumped 74 years. Okay, so that's, he's going to say that the other people said, we want to help build a temple. They said, no, you can't. And there started to be a whole bunch of discouragement. And the people were discouraging them. And he just jumped. Let me tell you about some of this. This king, when he was doing it, they discouraged him. When this king, they discouraged him. When this king came, they're still discouraging him. When this king came. He just jumped 74 years. Now, the reason he did it is because it was the illustration 74 years later that was the proof, the biggest proof of how they were discouraged. And then he starts to talk about the horrible things that they did to him 74 years ago, which we talked about last time I was here. At the end of chapter 4, he jumps back to the current time, when he says, now these people started to discourage them. So in chapter 5, he's back in the second year of Darius. He's back in the second year. So 18 years have passed since they began to build. 18 years. They built the temple, or they built the altar in 2 years. Now 18 years have gone by and the temple isn't built. They were a little bit like the church I pastored. The wind had gone out of their sails. That is a quote from one of the people who used to be a board member in that church. I got to know him, and he was one of the people who used to be a leader in the church, and now he's not involved in anything. And I had a meeting with him, went coffee with him. So what happened? And he says, well, I guess I lost the wind out of my sails. That was his description of what had happened when he saw this two pastors fighting, and then the church go down, and all the people that you were attending stopped attending, and the wind went out of his sails. That's exactly what happened to the Jews. They were given the privilege of coming back and building, and then the Samaritans came and says, well, we'd like to help. And they says, no, you really don't worship our God. And then they began to discourage him. And for the next 18 years, nothing happened. Chapter 5, we pick up what happened after 18 years. Here's what it says. Now Haggai, a prophet, and Zechariah, a prophet, descendant of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, son of Jozadak, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, helping them. So after 18 years, some prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, showed up, prophesied to them, and after 18 years, now we're starting to build again. And in fact, they finished building the temple in the next 4 years. So exactly what was it that Haggai and Zechariah said to him? Well, the last book in the Old Testament is Malachi. The two books before that are Haggai and Zechariah. So right at the end of the Old Testament is where you find those two books. Let me read what Haggai said to them. Remember, this happened in the second year of King Darius? Let me read Haggai chapter 1. In the second year of King Darius, on the first day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Those were the two people who led the new rebuilding process after 18 years. This is what the Lord Almighty says. The people say, the time has not yet come for the Lord's house to be built. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it time for you yourselves to be living in paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Be careful and give thought to your ways. You've planted much, but you harvested little. You eat, but you don't have enough. You drink, but you don't have your fill. You put on clothes, but they're not warm. You earn wages, only to put them in a purse with holes in them. Can you relate to some of those things? This is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build the house so that I might take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. You expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home I blew away. Why, declares the Lord? Because of my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with his own house. Therefore, because of you, the heavens have withheld their dew, and the earth its crops. The reason that you're in a situation where you're struggling and laboring and it doesn't seem you're getting ahead is not because you didn't make enough money. It's because you've lost the blessing of the Lord. Have you ever noticed that the people who seem to be content in life, they have everything they need, they're happy, are seldom the people who make the most money? You ever thought of that? The Bible tells us as Christians we ought to be content with a couple things. We should have food and clothing. 2 skidoos, a boat. It doesn't ask the skidoos, does it? Just food and clothing. If you got food and clothing, you should be. How many? I know you're all wearing clothing. That's good. Do we have a dress standard in this church? Yes, please wear some. And how many have eaten within the last 24 hours? Have you got a reason to be discontent? Sorry, that's a little harsh. Let's move on quickly before I get thrown out here. Roberta and I drove up this morning from Edson. There are places where the roads are painted with both living and dead caterpillars. Have you noticed that? The highway is a different color because of how many caterpillars there are. In the Bible days, they'd call it a plague. Now, the good thing is they primarily pick on poplar trees, which are, in fact, the fastest growing weed in Canada. I'm sorry if you're a logger and you like softwood, but they do grow fast, and there's not a whole lot of value in them. And I don't believe that they do any damage to the trees for the following years, but they sure make it look terrible. God is saying that although you worked, although you earned wages, you put them in a purse that had holes in it. You know, God's blessing isn't only found in your T4 slip. When you buy a vehicle that runs for another $200,000 and all you have to do is put in gas and change the oil, that's God's blessing. Okay? If you buy a Jeep Rubicon, even though your wife tells you don't buy a Jeep Rubicon, and then over the next few years you put more money into maintenance than you bought the Jeep Rubicon in the first place. Well, that's a subject we shouldn't talk about. Let's move on. You know what I mean? There are times, guys, God, you have blessed me. You blessed me. And perhaps there are times you say, God, you haven't been blessing me. Is there a reason? Have I focused all my time in paneling my house and not building? Okay, so that's Haggai. Let's quickly look. He said Haggai and Zechariah. Zechariah, he also got in on this. Let's see what Zechariah said. In the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah. The Lord was very angry with your forefathers. Therefore, tell the people, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Return to me, and I will return to you. Don't be like your forefathers, to whom the earlier prophets proclaimed. This is what the Lord says. Turn from your evil ways and your evil practices. But they would not listen or pay attention to me, declares the Lord. Where are they now? And the prophets, do they live forever? but did not my words and the prophets overtake your forefathers? Same message. You want God's blessing? Be obedient. Obedience is the watershed issue of Christianity. Let me explain that. Not the water table. Okay, sometimes people get the difference between the water table and the watershed. The watershed is the point where the water is either going to go to one ocean or another ocean. So the clearest example to us is the border between Alberta and BC. When you go to British Columbia, go past Jasper, you start climbing up, and you're driving into water that's flowing towards you. And then you go over Mount Robson, and you come to water that's going the same direction as you. And there's a real weird line in that part of Alberta. That's the dividing line between Alberta. Why didn't they make a straight line? Because they chose to follow the watershed. Between Alberta and Saskatchewan, between the northern parts of Alberta, there's straight lines on the map, right? But then in the bottom part, there's these weird, that's because so you can be standing in a place, and if the rain falls, the rain that hits your right foot is going to end up in the Pacific Ocean, go to British Columbia, and the rain that hits your left foot is going to end up in the Atlantic Ocean. It's real obvious where that watershed is, right? Some watersheds aren't so obvious. If you drive from here to Entwistle, and then you turn right and head towards Edmonton, within the next 10 miles, you're going to go through another watershed. The Pembina River flows in to eventually to the Athabasca and up to the Mackenzie and out to the Atlantic Ocean. But if you go about 10 miles before you get to Wabamun, there's a different watershed. And all that watershed is going to end up in the North Saskatchewan, which will end up in the Saskatchewan, which will end up in the Lake Winnipeg, which will end up in the Hudson Bay, and end up eventually into the Atlantic Ocean. That's not so obvious, that watershed, is it? How many didn't even know there was a watershed there? Right now, water that's rain that lands here is going to end up in the Atlantic Ocean, and you drive 10 miles now, water that lands here is going to end up in the Atlantic Ocean. That just doesn't seem logical, does it? But it's true. See, not all watersheds are quite as obvious, but obedience is the watershed issue of Christianity. When God tells you what to do, and you know this is God's plan, most of it isn't hard to understand. It's just written down here. Okay? The vast majority of God's will for you is black and white. You don't have to ask God about a lot of things in life, and I won't give you examples. You know what they are. They're just, these are my commands. This is what I want you to do. There are some things that God lets us make a decision. God, what are you saying? Should I do this? And they're not quite as obvious as the BC-Alberta divider. But there are times when we know God has asked me to do something. And if we choose to do it, we start moving towards an ocean that's eventually going to take us to heaven. We're getting closer and closer. Moving the right direction. But if we decide, no, I'm going to stand on this side of the wall, I'm not going to obey. That's just a small thing. But I'm not going to obey. I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to choose my will over God's. And I continue to choose my will over God's. And I get further and further away. So, that's why they were in this situation. So now this guy named Tatantai, he just happens to be the governor who is in charge, who is ruling over that area. Now, he's not antagonistic towards the Jews, but he's the ruler. And he sees all of this money and labor and valuable stuff goes into this temple. And he's a little bit concerned because when Darius, the new king, discovers how much money and how much labor is going into the temple rather than into his tax, he just might be a little bit upset. And so he writes a letter to the governor, to the king, Darius. Tattentai, the governor, writes a letter to Darius, and he says, do you know what these people are doing? In fact, I've actually gone to them. I've got their names so you can know who they are. They claim that Cyrus gave them permission to do this. I just want you to check the records, because I want you to know that they're putting all this money and all this labor into this temple. And if you are not, if Cyrus did not make that decree, then I will do my part to stop it. He just wants to make sure that the king is happy. But he makes a couple of interesting statements. First of all, he says this: they're doing this, chapter 5. This is the verse that we read. They're doing this. They're building this thing, and it's going. Why? Because, here's his quote. This is a believer. This is a guy who worships idols. He's just writing a letter to the king saying, wasn't me. Don't blame me for all this money. In fact, I want to let you know that all this money is not going to taxes. Are you okay with that, king? He's not antagonistic towards him. He just wants to cover his own self. But he's describing what's happening, and this is what he says. The eye of their God was watching over the elders of the Jews. That's a non-Christian. I don't understand it, but their God is for them. I don't even know if our God is for or against us. I'm not even sure if they're real. But their God is for them, and that's why they're doing so well. The eye of their... Know that the eye of God is on you. You're his child. He takes that personally. And then he describes another thing. Let me read the next description. He's just saying to the king, this is what those guys are doing. Let me read that part to you. The king should know that we went to the district of Judah, to the temple of the great God. Notice where he put the word great. He did not say we went to Judah to the great temple of God. He didn't say the temple was great. He said we went to the temple, the great God. I just want to suggest that there's lots of people that are our friends and neighbors who recognize that God is a great God. Just not part of their lives. That's where Tattentai was. He says, I know that they have God's blessing. Their lives just show God's blessing. The joy is on their faces. And I know that their God is the great God. How do we respond? I want you to think back now. Earlier I said, think about a time when God literally stepped in and protected you from an accident, from a loss of a job, from a loss of income. Think about a time where you can just say, the eye of my God was upon. Can you think of a time like that? The eye of my God? I won't ask you, can you think of a time when that God... I can think of 3 times specifically when I should have been killed. Train accident of a train that was going 85 miles an hour, according to the engineer. When I woke up driving and I was too tired. And I woke up on the side of the ditch, the truck sliding sideways, and a power pole coming very swiftly towards me. A time when I'd been working in my career and had driven a long ways, worked in the middle of the night, and had got a call out and came back, and all of a sudden I woke up and there's the guardrail over a creek, and my truck is headed right for the center of that guardrail. If I had woke up a split second later, things would have been totally different. Because the eye of our God was upon me, and he really is great God. Amen? God bless you.